and our rights are being threatened by a tyrant 3,000 miles away.
Would you tell me, please, Mr. Howard, why should I trade one tyrant 3,000 miles away for 3,000 tyrants 1 mile away? An elected legislature can trample a man's rights as easily as a king can.
Hey everybody, Byron here. Let's talk about sacred cows. A sacred cow is a societal institution or assumption which is considered beyond reproach or beyond question. Something with a quasi-religious significance of the kind that makes people extremely upset when you challenge it in any way. It's always an interesting exercise to find out what the sacred cows in a given society are. That can be very revealing of that society. And since at least the world wars, the Western world has had one giant one. Can you guess what it is? Oh, that's cheating. You read the title of the video. Well, the elephant, or I guess cow in the room, is democracy. As you've probably guessed from the title of the video, I am going to be attacking this proverbial cow. But before you get mad, let's talk for a minute about what democracy actually is. A lot of times you see the mainstream media talk about things like free speech, property rights, and habeas corpus as though they were facets of democracy. Really though, these things have nothing to do with democracy, and in fact, they're often in direct opposition to it. All democracy means is for political decisions to be made by the will of the majority. Concepts like free speech and habeas corpus, these are facets of classical liberalism. The idea that the individual has certain rights which should be upheld even when they aren't convenient for the state. Now, by historical coincidence, these two concepts, individual rights and the will of the majority, they've become entangled, and most people in the Western world now claim to be supporters of both. So the natural question is, what should happen when the majority support policies which are incompatible with the liberal notions we've talked about? I am far from the first person to ask this question. Take, for example, Nobel Prize-winning Austrian economist F.A. Hayek, who wrote, "As you will understand, it is possible for a dictator to govern in a liberal way, and it is also possible for a democracy to govern with a total lack of liberalism. Personally, I prefer a liberal dictator to democratic government lacking liberalism." While that quote is a little spicy for mainstream conservatives, they do sometimes go so far as to emphatically declare that the US is not a democracy, but a republic, which they say is a different thing. Their argument goes like this: "We have a Bill of Rights that are enshrined in the Constitution, such that there are things the state can't do to people, even when it has the support of the majority. And we don't have people directly voting on everything. That would be mob rule. We have elected representatives representing our voters while protecting individual rights." This line of argumentation is good because it shows that the people making it at least understand that there is some tension here, but there are also some problems with it. Firstly, and I don't want to focus too much on this point because it's mostly semantic, but this idea that the US is not a democracy because democracy only means direct democracy, it's very silly. That's not how the word is normally used. We normally talk about ancient Greece as the birthplace of democracy, but it's not as though every citizen of Athens voted in a referendum on every single issue. Rome didn't work like that either. Really, no state has ever worked like that. There's always been at least one layer between the state's legislative process and regular citizens voting. Now, to the conservatives' point, I do think that you can say that the existence of these intermediary structures like the Senate and the House makes society less democratic. And I agree that that is a good thing. But many of the underlying problems are still there. You can't simply define them away by contrasting the existing government with some hypothetical, more severe form of mob rule which has never actually existed. And speaking of these underlying problems, it's not as though the Bill of Rights makes us immune to the kind of things it was meant to protect against. In the very first video on this channel, we discussed how the letter of the law doesn't really matter all that much. And in practice, the Constitution just basically goes out the window whenever it gets in the way of what the state wants to do. The NSA wipes its butt with the Fourth Amendment, for example. And it's easy enough to say, well, that's bad. I don't support that. The government shouldn't violate the Constitution. But okay, putting that aside, even if it followed the letter of the law, all the state needs to completely repeal the Bill of Rights is a 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress, or a 3/4 majority of the state legislatures. And I'm not saying that that's going to happen, to be clear, because there's much easier ways for them to get around the Constitution. But if it did, do we have to support that now? They followed all the rules, right? I guess it's okay for the mob to take all your rights away, so long as they fill out the paperwork correctly. Democracy in action.
This is Democracy Manifest.
Of course, that's completely ridiculous. I think most freedom-loving Americans would agree that if the Bill of Rights were repealed, that would justify immediate direct resistance, regardless of how or why it happened or any technicalities involved. But what's so special about these rights explicitly enumerated in the bill? One of America's most prescient founding fathers, Patrick Henry, broke with the other anti-federalists when he gave a speech criticizing the idea of the Bill of Rights. To quote it, "The restraints in this Congressional Bill of Rights are so feeble and few that it would have been infinitely better to have said nothing about it. The fair implication is that they can do everything they are not forbidden to do." That's a very good point. But the other founding fathers basically responded, "Nah, Patrick, come on, man, that would never happen. We're just listing some of the lines the government can't cross. People will get the idea." Spoiler alert, they didn't get the idea. My point in bringing this up is that people would be justifiably outraged by the violation, democratic or otherwise, of their rights enumerated in the Bill of Rights. But really, you should be outraged by the violation of any of your rights, period, regardless of whether they're written down on a piece of paper or not, regardless of how many idiots vote for it. To put this in the most blunt and direct terms possible, do you think a gang rape is more justified than a single person committing rape? Do you think a lynch mob is more justified than a regular murder? If so, please stay far away from me, because you just might believe in democracy. And it sounds like I'm memeing or something, but that's really it. That's what democracy is. The completely bizarre idea that how justified something is somehow related to how many people are doing it. Democracy apologists will throw out 1,000 little caveats and circumstances to try to disguise the fundamental nature of what they're advocating. But at its most naked, most basic level, democracy is as the old adage goes, 2 wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. Like I said, I do not claim to be the first person to notice this. Plato noticed it 2,400 years ago when a butthurt mob murdering Socrates wasn't any better than because they voted on it. But there's always someone coming out of the woodwork to say, well, what are we supposed to do instead? And Churchill, you know that imperialist who advocated destroying Dublin, the guy who created the famine in Bengal? Yeah, that guy. Churchill said, "Democracy is the worst form of government except for all the other forms that have been tried." Sorry about that Churchill accent, but let's address the idea. It's a little weird to respond to this because the way the quote is phrased, Churchill makes it sound like democracy is some yes or no form of government, which either exists or doesn't at any given place in time. In reality, of course, just like capitalism or socialism or anything else, democracy is a sliding scale, as we discussed earlier. Be that as it may, there's absolutely no shortage of real-life examples of increased levels of democracy resulting in greater oppression, more authoritarian governments, etc. Or you could go the opposite way, less democracy resulting in more individual freedom. Either way, the most obvious cases that really jump out at you are from the Middle East. In countries like Libya, Egypt, and Syria, you've had a situation where the majority of the population favors repressive, reactionary, theocratic government. Imagine Rick Santorum, but about 10 times worse. Women forced to wear hijab, homosexuality being illegal, etc. And historically, the main thing that's kept these countries from succumbing to this and slipping into fundamentalism is the fact that they're not very democratic. What you have is these small Western educated elite minorities who live mostly in the big cities and want to have pretty much normal lives. These minorities tend to control the military, who then intervene and overthrow any government that gets too fundamentalist. Or they try, at least. I mean, it doesn't help when the U.S. decides to sweep in and back the jihadists because they're more friendly to Israel. You might have seen the old pictures of women wearing miniskirts in Afghanistan or Iran. That freedom is a product of undemocratic regimes, make no mistake. Really, though, none of this should be that shocking. Just think about the political views of the average person, even in America, and compare them to how things actually are. Depending on the place and time, the average person might be better on some issues, but on many others, they're far worse. And I'm not just talking about the Middle East. Look at polls that ask Americans about things like free speech, for example. Pew has found that the percentage of Americans who support restrictions on speech offensive to minorities has steadily increased over time, to the point where if present trends continue, it will be a majority in the very near future. And while this hasn't been a super hot button issue lately, Gallup has conducted polls as recently as the mid-2000s, which found a majority support for legal punishment of burning the flag. Another very obvious violation of free speech. So thank God we're not any more democratic than we already are. That's the takeaway there. But why is it that democracies choose bad policies? Well, a common argument made by democracy apologists is that, when policy is up for public debate, the masses will be able to evaluate different proposals and pick the best, and that over time, bad policies will thus be weeded out. This is a very cute story, but obviously it has nothing to do with reality. Why not? Well, first of all, it's a pretty big fallacy to assume that voters even vote based on policy in the first place. Every presidential election, there's some clever talk show host who interviews voters and asks them about their preferred candidate's policies. Only, here's the prank. The prank is, unbeknownst to the voter, they're really describing the other candidate's policies. Wow.
And would you support Hillary Clinton's plan to cut the corporate tax rate from 35% to 15%?
I think that's a good idea.
Do you support Hillary's plan to eliminate the estate tax?
Yes, I do support that.
Do you support her plan to eliminate taxes for those who make less than $25,000 a year?
I would support that, yes.
Do you support her plan to eliminate the alternative minimum tax?
Alternative minimum tax. Yeah, I support that.
Do you support her plan to eliminate the estate tax?
Yes.
And what would you say if I told you those are all Donald Trump's proposals?
Every single time this is done, without fail, the voter will always say, I think that's a great idea. Like some glitching NPC reading the wrong script or something. Aside from very broad points, the average voter has absolutely no idea what their candidate's policies are. And why would they? They don't support them because of policy. They support them because of cultural and demographic identity. If you doubt this, just listen to a so-called presidential debate. They're not debating anything. Can you imagine if they were? Well, President Biden, I don't think that their argument follows because your second premise doesn't hold. No. They make no attempt to refute each other. You're lucky if they even acknowledge each other's arguments at all. Instead, the debate consists mostly of the candidates just essentially taking turns reciting their pre-written catchphrases for a couple hours. If that's not an indictment of democracy, I really don't know what is. How could anyone possibly think that it's a good idea to choose government policy based on which demographic coalition can get more people to show up? During the 2020 Democratic primary, Michael Bloomberg took a lot of heat from the left, who they claimed he was trying to buy his way into the election. And to be clear, they were completely correct about that. That's exactly what he was doing. But was that undemocratic in any way? If people had voted for him because a celebrity told them to on TV, then isn't that the will of the people? One would hope that the left might learn something from that close call. namely how easy it is for the powers that be to manipulate the masses into voting for even someone so unlikable a fascist as Michael Stop and Frisk Bloomberg. But, who am I kidding? This is the left we're talking about. They're never going to learn anything. Bloomberg. Anyway, insofar as voters do have opinions about actual issues, as I mentioned earlier, these opinions tend to be really stupid and illiberal. Why wouldn't they be? It's not like the voters have any incentive to be correct about policy. When you're wrong about whether there's food in your refrigerator or something like that, you're going to end up hungry or wasting money. But what happens when you're wrong about the effects of free trade? Nothing. Nothing. There are only so many hours in a day, and most people, let's be honest, find reading about that kind of thing extremely boring. So why should they spend their time trying to come to the truth of the matter when they could be binge watching Disney+? This is what's known in public choice theory as rational ignorance. But it gets even worse because there's also something called rational irrationality. And Brian Kaplan talks about this. He's an economist in his very good book, The Myth of the Rational Voter, where basically he explains that just purely the act of holding certain beliefs can actually have utility. So in other words, people like believing certain things and dislike believing other things because it feels good or feels bad. And this holds regardless of the actual truth of those beliefs. So, for example, if I'm from a cultural group, which believes that immigrants steal jobs from people like me, I benefit from holding that belief because it's something I can use to bond with my friends and signal my loyalty to the group. If I change my mind on this topic, my friends might start to like me less. Now, if you're a libertarian, you might have had an experience like that at some point. But all of this is probably not even the worst part of democracy. The worst part is the incentive structure it establishes for politicians. In his book, Democracy, the God That Fails, political theorist Hans Hermann Hoppe explains how under a monarchy, for instance, the king has a very strong incentive to rule with the long-term success of his kingdom in mind. He'll rule for probably his entire life, and when he dies, presumably he'll leave the kingdom to his heir, probably a close relative, if not his son. So he has every reason not to do anything short-sighted that might screw the kingdom over. Now, if you compare that to the incentives of a democratically elected president, I think the problem is going to become pretty apparent. Because a democratic president has a short term, and so, if he has the opportunity to do something like, create a housing bubble, that's going to make the economy appear, at least, to be doing very well in the short term, and he'll get all the credit for it. And sure, that might lead to a recession eventually, but if he times it right, his term will be over by then. It'll get blamed on someone else. Now, this all leads to this weird situation where politicians gain and maintain power by constantly bribing the apathetic masses with their own money. Here, take a stimulus check. Where's the money coming from? Oh, don't worry about that. That's for future people to figure out. So, if it isn't abundantly clear by now, this is kind of a pet issue of mine, this whole democracy thing. I could honestly sit here just at my desk, White Claw in hand, ranting about this all night, but you guys don't want to hear that. So, I know this is abrupt, but we do have to say goodbye at some point. One thing I'll say before I go is please do leave a comment below about what you'd like to see us cover in future videos, because I really will read every single comment, and unless it's, just something weird and random, I'll probably even respond. But anyway, until next week, comrades, peace to you and yours.
Thanks for watching Springtime of Nations, your source for libertarian and pan-secessionist commentary and analysis. We'll be back next week with more content. Be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. See you next time.
Get your hand off my penis!